This is the Wandering Mike.
Welcome, everyone, to the Wandering Mike. Today, I'm here with Jesse. Hey, Jesse, how's it going?
Thanks, Mike. It's going well. It's a pleasure to be here.
Cool. Yeah, I can't wait for our conversation. Very sure it's going to be an interesting one. Um, to get us started, if you just quickly want to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your life, your journey, anything you want to share.
My name is Jesse. I kind of see myself as a curious person. My entire life really has been led by a desire to learn, a desire to play, a desire to experiment. I've always sort of seen myself as a kind of growing person. Bob Dylan has this great line: "Those not busy being born are busy dying." So I'm
Mm.
constantly trying to be born. I'm constantly trying to embrace life. And it's led me on a very diverse and enjoying path. I kind of professionally go under the title of futurist, but I'm a kind of a reluctant futurist because I'm still not convinced that the future exists. I only ever experience a series of todays. It seems like every day is today. So
Mm.
while I entertain the idea of the future, while I enjoy talking to people about the future, I'm still kind of a skeptic about this concept of the future. And I think part of what makes my approach to futurism a little different than, the average futurist. And in the last 8 years of my life, I've become a farmer. Partly because I wanted to be at the front lines of climate change. I wanted to have a direct hand in where my food comes from. And fundamentally, that was just about learning. That I had gotten to a point where I didn't have enough challenges, I didn't have enough opportunities to be learning in a really rapid manner. And farming is a near infinite a source of learning and knowledge and humility when it comes to being a person who wants to keep evolving.
All right. There were so many interesting things already in what you just said. So, um, let's start it off from the beginning, and maybe we're just gonna intertwine some of these things anyway. Um, but being a curious person, what has led you to be that way? I mean, obviously, and I feel like everyone should be a curious person, and on some level, most people are in some aspects. But what made you really feel like, no, I need to know, I need to find out, I need to learn?
I think the short answer, sadly, is my parents. I grew up in a household where every inch of every wall was covered in art or posters
Mm.
or something visually stimulating. They had hundreds and hundreds of books on all sorts of subjects, and they were always playing music, and the radio was always on. So it was really a household of ideas, a household of debates and discussions, and
Right.
appreciating this concept of the artist as the antenna, right? The artist as the kind of early warning signal for society, sort of interpreting, what's happening and helping us to understand it. And so I guess that curiosity was just part of the water. It was part of the culture in which I grew up. And it wasn't until I was older, it wasn't until I was in high school that I started to realize not everyone had that not everyone grew up
Yeah.
in a household where curiosity was what was cultivated and was kind of the staple of, how you saw the world. And once I realized I had that advantage, it's like someone who's, really good at sports and then they double down and they say, "Okay, I'm gonna be an athlete." I sort of doubled down
Right.
and said, "Okay, I'm gonna be really curious, even if that makes people upset." And it certainly has been a very exciting and interesting path to take.
I like that little insight as well very much that when we grow up, everything is normal, right? Because we're growing up, and then we see how other people do things, and we're like, "Well, yeah, it's not like that everywhere." That, now that's a cool insight. Um, so before we're gonna get to the farming part, because yeah, as you said, it's a pool of learning. So I really want to dig into that one as well. You also said an interesting thing about being a futurist. So um, kind of the same question, but also because what got you interested in the future in particular, but then also where was that? Because I could kind of hear it already that, well, is the future that important? Is it the today? Is it the now? Like what kind of conclusion did you not there?
That's an excellent question, and if I were honest, I'd say for much of my life, I had a very problematic relationship with time. And I sort
Mm,
of knew that I had a very bad relationship with time. I was either impatient or I was rushing or I might be
uh,
bored. I was never, happy in the moment. I was always thinking that tomorrow would be better, or maybe tomorrow would be worse, or maybe yesterday was better. And I sort of knew something was wrong, but for many years I didn't understand why. And perhaps it was when I moved back out of the city into the country that I slowed down, and I started to realize that there's a rhythm to cities that was too fast for me, and that I wanted a different rhythm, and that allowed me to get a greater sense of the present and past and future. But more practically, it was technology, right? From a young
mm,
age, I was very curious about technology. I was curious about media. I was fascinated by how people could use technology and gain power and do things they couldn't do without the technology. And then I realized that translation was a very powerful, valuable role in the technology world, because where there's, a lot of tech talk, a lot of nerd speak, most people don't understand it. And so for many years, I got work and found a success and value translating technology to regular people. Translating technology to business leaders, so that instead of it being all complicated, I would use metaphor to make it very simple. And then people started telling me, "Hey, that you're a futurist. That's what futurists do." And so I
mm,
kind of backed into the role that I was so steeped in technology. I was trying to align myself with the internet, thinking that wherever the internet goes, well, that's where I'll go. And it turns out the internet's headed to the future. So it was
mm.
really just a way of accidentally finding myself in those conversations, right? At those, opportunities. And so I'm kind of transparent in saying I'm a reluctant futurist and that I don't fully believe that there's a future, or at least I ask myself, if we can remember the past, why can't we remember the future? And it's these
Mm.
types of paradoxes that I think make the field of futurism fun. But again, it's most people try to say, "Oh, and I expect this technology will go by this," or hard predictions, versus I see it as an opportunity for philosophy, and that can benefit
Right.
anybody and everybody.
Yeah. Um, and yeah, maybe I'll ask that more as a question because you that were into that technology a lot more, you probably have more insight than I do. But um, do you also see that maybe it is hard to predict because maybe your predictions were different 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even, and because it's so rapidly evolving, right?
Well, and predictions are a form of accountability that I think is an important part of testing a futurist's credibility. And I've enjoyed going back and looking at my past predictions and seeing, in some cases, how I was completely wrong, and in other
Mm,
cases, how I sort of got it on the mark. But at the same
right.
time, there's a humility to being a futurist that I like. And the joke I sometimes like to make is futurists have the same accuracy rate as weather forecasters, which is
Mhm.
generally pretty poor, right? And
Okay.
if you can accept that, if you can accept that most of the time futurists are wrong, and maybe it's just a form of entertainment, then again, that kind of humility I think is good for people, because really the point of a futurist isn't to give you a set and certain future, but it's to help you prepare for uncertainty. It's to help you prepare for change, to prepare for things that you're not expecting. Because that's what frustrates people in life, is when something happens to them that they weren't prepared for, that emotionally they weren't expecting. And so part of the role of the futurist, as a kind of social psychologist, is to prepare people for what we can all now sort of guess and accept, that our future is going to be radically different from our past, whether that's because of climate change,
Yeah.
whether that's because of technology, whether that's just because of politics. And so it's good for
Yeah.
people to go through that exercise and think, oh, okay, yeah. And then imagine a future they desire and start working towards it.
Mm. Um, there were again some more things that I want to get into, but I want to get into that part where you mentioned it's translating technology. Um, maybe if that's not too much to ask, maybe we can use that skill of yours and you can try and translate AI for us. Well, how would you translate that to the
Well, I think the easiest way is to say it's not a technology, it's a story. Right? If you ask people specifically, what is AI? Is it machine learning? Is it algorithms? Is it large language models? It's a lot of things. Like, it's kind of a toolbox. And in that toolbox, there are all sorts of statistical tools, computational tools. But the most important
people?
thing is it's a story. AI right now is a story that we're telling each other, that the tech industry is telling the world, and it's a story about change. It's a story about cloud computing, because most AI does not run on your desktop computer. It does not run on your smartphone, right? If we think
Mm,
about this as a business, it's businesses like ChatGPT and businesses like Amazon and businesses like Google who want you to pay a monthly fee to use
right.
their services in the cloud. So, in that sense, AI is kind of a marketing story. It's a story they're trying to use to sell these advanced services. But it's also a story, and this is, I say this critically, more like a myth. It's a story kind of about this thing coming alive, this machine that's getting smarter and smarter. And depending on who you talk to, it's a god that could have all this great knowledge and all this great power. To which I say nonsense. That's just a story, right? It's a story they're telling us. And part of the reason that we are getting these very powerful stories when it comes to AI is these are powerful tools. Like, for example, another way to describe AI is its pattern recognition. So it's finding the needles in the haystack. If you were to go through the web and say, I'm interested in finding articles about how libraries should be organized, well, if there were no librarians to organize all that information, you wouldn't find any of it. And now in AI, we kind of have automated librarians like search engines, which can automatically index and organize everything we need to find online. So again, AI is a tool. It's a statistical tool. It's an informational tool. It's a knowledge tool. It's not something that thinks on its own. It's not a living entity. It's not even necessarily the greatest thing since sliced bread, but it is a very powerful story that I think has caught our attention and is exciting because of the things that it can do. I like that, for example, it can automatically transcribe a conversation like we're having and make something like that more accessible, but it won't understand the conversation we're having. It'll just be able to statistically analyze all the words, but the actual wisdom that you and I are trying to share with each other, fundamentally, that is for humans only.
Yeah. Um, I actually had uh, quite an interesting conversation with uh, someone I did the podcast here in person as well, as he was a software engineer, and we just kind of didn't go into too much detail because it wasn't his expertise as well. But from what you just said as well, because one could argue it transcribes it, and if we ask it what the main points were of the conversation, it would also give us those main points. But um, obviously, I also think even though giving these points, it wouldn't understand them on that level you just mentioned. So um, we kind of got into because it is called artificial intelligence. So, what does that tell us about us as humans as well? Because what is intelligence? We kind of were talking about tests, right? You can like just remember things and then you can ace a test, but is that intelligence?
Well, and this is where I'll say I think one of the best byproducts of the rise of AI is it's helping us understand ourselves. It's helping us
Mm.
understand our own intelligence. It's helping us understand our own concept of being a human. Because where the cognitive research, the neuroscience research, the psychology is all coming to a consensus, is that emotion and reason are inseparable. That intelligence is both a byproduct of our analytical capabilities, but also our emotional capabilities. And if you think about that, there's a kind of sweet spot, an emotional sweet spot when we operate at our best, when we're well fed, when we're happy, when we're loved, when we've had a good night's sleep. Versus if you start to take out some of those variables, right? If you haven't slept well, if you haven't been eating well, if, maybe you just got dumped or you just broke up with a loved one, you're not thinking straight. You're not thinking as clearly. And it's remarkable how the more we understand intelligence, the more we recognize that it's tied to our bodies. And, for example, there's also research now that our brains, our minds are not just in our head, but it's in the bacteria in our guts, right? That our
Mm.
entire immune system is part of how we process information, how we experience emotions, how we sense and understand the external world. So I think our notion of intelligence is not just statistical understanding or reasoning, but it's also really our experience with the world, right? Our intuition, our feelings, our situational awareness. So again, I think the benefit of the rise of AI is it's helping us understand what it means to be human. And I think one of the things that we forgot in the last 100 years, maybe 200 years, is that we're animals, right? We are fundamentally animals, and we've evolved as animals for tens and hundreds of thousands of years. We may like to think that we can upload our consciousness into the machine and be like a machine, but the reality is our humanity, our intelligence is part of our biology. It's part of kind of our entire evolutionary path. So I still think it's a mystery. I still think that there are certain things about ourselves that we don't understand that AI is going to help us understand by crunching the numbers, by allowing us to do research that wasn't previously possible. But at the same time, I don't think we should reduce the concept of intelligence to something computational when it is much more interdisciplinary, to use an academic frame.
Yeah, yeah. I think that also might be the biggest upside AI has. We can just analyze things just in way bigger dimensions. That's because you would need many humans with many lifetimes, probably, and AI can just do these things a lot quicker.
Well, and that's the needles in the haystack, that we can have
Right.
bigger and bigger haystacks and look for very specific needles, and AI is great at finding that stuff. It doesn't know what the needle is, and it doesn't even
Yeah.
understand the nature of the haystack. But, as a tool for humans to understand ourselves, to understand our world, it is tremendously powerful.
maybe I will ask one little question, more of an entertaining way, because we were pretty fact on. But do you at all see a future where this AI, or maybe a version 10 point, 100 point, something, can ever understand these things and come to some kind of, well, consciousness or whatever we want to call it?
So all futures are possible. Is I think, the starting point any humble futurist has to take. But I think, to answer your question, it's doubtful. I think what is more likely is the illusion of that it's
Mm,
far easier to manufacture the perception of consciousness, to create a grand puppet, than it would be to create a great god. And human history is full of religious institutions that have manufactured a god or gods as a means of social control, right? As a way
mm,
of making sure that people give their profits to the temple and do what the temple priests say. And that is my fear. That is certainly, if you suggest that those who are currently devout believers in the singularity, in the belief that AI will come alive, that they are a kind of religion, and they will be the clergy. They will be the beneficiaries if everyone agrees that this great puppet has this great reasoning. Because I think, to go back to our question of what is intelligence, where on the one hand, I'm arguing that we as a species still don't know. On the other hand, it's really easy to simulate it. It's really easy to fool people into thinking something is intelligent. And I think that is far more likely, right? Because the statistical power we're describing, the ability to find those needles in the haystack, is already awe-inspiring. Like, it already, the ability
yeah,
to, for example, connect the dots in human research, that is a tremendous power. Like, if you're a researcher, a professor who spent like the last 30 years doing your work, and all of a sudden now you have AI as
yeah,
part of your methodological playbook, right? You're having a great time. Your mind is blown. You're doing things that you
yeah,
could only imagine. But that's my point. It's a human who's doing that. And so we live in a society where there's already great disparity between the rich and poor, but there's also great disparity in terms of the tools that we have access to. Like, I would love to have access to a massive metal-based 3D printer that allowed me to
yeah,
create, infinite near objects out of steel, because such machines exist, but they cost a lot of money. And steel costs a lot of money, and you need a lot of heavy equipment to move this stuff around. So the question fundamentally is, who gets access to the AI? Who gets to use these tools?
right.
Who gets to benefit from this? And the incentive is that the people who do want to create a reason to scare everybody else off, so only they have the competitive advantage that this tool offers. And to me, that is the narrative of singularity. That's why I don't believe it will ever become conscious. But I do believe that people will tell everyone else, hey, it's conscious, to scare them, to control them. Because the things you can do with this tool are incredible. Like, really, really powerful. And, if everyone had access to it, well, we'd be living in a different kind of.
Yeah, that's also an interesting question, maybe, because there's people, and I'm also, honestly, one of those people who is like, I probably could use AI for a lot of things that I do, and that would really help me and that would save some time. But then I'm also like, well, I can also just do them myself. So, and I think more so people that, not to generalize, but maybe older than me even, and just like don't see a point in like learning a new technology just to help us with these things. So as you were saying, you think everyone should learn that technology though, because it is helpful to everyone?
More than everyone should have the choice. Because I
Right.
agree with you, there's a lot, to not pick on AI, but to use technology as a larger frame. I think convenience is dangerous, right? And a lot of our technology focuses on convenience, right? To make things easy for you. And I'm of the belief that some things in life should be hard. That the
Yeah.
reason they should be hard is there's learning there, right? If it's too easy, there's no friction. There's not an opportunity to make a mistake and then learn from that mistake. And so
Yeah.
I definitely agree with the idea that, for example, knowing how to write, knowing how to read, knowing how to think critically, these are not things you need to delegate to AI, because these are skills cognitively that you want to maintain, especially as you age. But my point is just everyone should have their own choice, right? If they want to do it, they can. If they don't want to do it, they don't have to. And more importantly, on the issue of AI ethics, I think we're going to have a very sort of political environment in which I think we should all have our own AI ethics. Like, I don't think we should restrict what these tools can do. If someone does something bad with these
Yeah.
tools, punish the person, right? Not the
Right.
AI. Like, don't restrict, like, for example, with the tools that can create images, they, try
Yeah.
to restrict the kind of images that can be created. And I think that's a fool's game. I don't think that they're gonna stop the criminals from doing that, because there's open source models that they can figure out on their own. And I think everyone should be punished for their actions, not for the actions that they might make. And so there's this big debate around, is AI this powerful tool? Should it be restricted? Should some people have access to it? Some people shouldn't. And in that sense, I'm kind of like, it's too powerful a tool to restrict. We shouldn't restrict the tool. We should restrict people the way we always have, right? If you hurt someone, you should be held accountable. And that again makes me feel like we're putting too much attention on the tool and not enough attention on us and our choices and our ability to make these decisions.
I feel like that's a um bigger discussion as well because I feel like we always have treated the internet basically as a very or a place where, or at least now, we want to be more restrictive. As in the beginning, we probably weren't because it was all new and everything. But, and maybe that's just my personal interpretation. The reasoning is because it is accessible online to everyone. So maybe if we let the tool do something, we may inspire people to do it. Maybe that's the reasoning. But yeah, just not only AI, but the internet itself. I mean, that's the question, right? Should we restrict what is shown there, or should, like you said, the people have the choice and with our own reasoning basically decide, do I want to interact with this?
Well, and to your point about the historical kind of trajectory, I think we made a big mistake in the 90s when the internet started to rise by having that laissez-faire approach, by taking that hands-off approach. Instead, we should have asked ourselves, what rules in a democracy should the internet have? Because the authoritarian countries, they ask themselves, well, what rules for the internet should we have in an authoritarian country? And they came up with those rules, right? And those rules in some cases tend to be more attractive to governments or attractive to companies, when we should have came up with what we thought of as the democratic rules for the internet, like respect, for example. And privacy might have been another one. And I think because we failed to do so, because we just pretended the internet would be great on its own, we kind of have the contentious, sometimes toxic, sometimes confusing, overwhelming internet that we have. And I think the response to that still has to be, what are our social values online? And, you know, Twitter became X partly because Twitter tried to have rules, right? After a long time, Twitter was like, okay, we need to have rules. We can't just be this open free for all. And, X kind of came about because people rejected those rules, right? And now they're like, no, 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 we can't have any rules. So I'm kind of torn. There are some people who say, the internet is always going to find a way to get around rules. The internet is always going to find a way to get around restrictions. But I actually think that there's an opportunity for a social contract. So these are not so much rules enforced by technology, but rules enforced by people. Because if you had an online forum, if you had a social media platform, if you had a subreddit where everybody said respect is our number one rule, and you can disagree, you don't have to like people, but as soon as you disrespect, we kick you out. End of story. You could do it, right? And it's just a
Yeah.
matter of the social value of people deciding that respect was something that they wanted to cherish and they wanted to value. And hopefully that'll still happen, but that's something I think the internet generally culturally has struggled with.
Do you, do you think, because that's an interesting point as well, that maybe the anonymity of the internet makes it easier, though, to not abide by social values and morality?
People have argued that for as long as the internet has been around, and it's hard to disprove, but I've never agreed with it. And I say that because there's a lot of examples of people doing bad things under their real name. And and I think the issue is not so much anonymity, it's dopamine. Right? That attention gives
Mm.
us a rush. Attention gives us a kind of power. Attention gives us a kind of status. Whether that's attention is for anonymous because you don't have the courage to do it under your own name, or whether that is using it under your own name. I think if we were to somehow, by some magic, terrible way, to ban anonymity, I think we'd still have a huge problem with jerks and disrespect. And so I actually believe in anonymity. I think that there are circumstances where we could have kind of moderated anonymity, where you sort of have a chain of trust where to the rest of the world you're anonymous, but not to your parents, right? So fundamentally, if someone says, "Hey,
Mm.
internet user 123 is being really mean," then it actually sends a note to their parents. And then their parents could be
Mm.
like, "Come on, Jesse, you're out of line here. You really need to get it together." As one silly example. But
Yeah,
I think even if we were to get rid of anonymity, we would still have this problem.
that actually is quite a great idea that I don't think I heard anywhere else before. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Um, maybe to because I also want to get to the farming part, but I just because we are in the technology topic right now, um, what do you generally think about Web3 and all that development? Because yeah, I just want to pick your brain on that as well.
I'm skeptical. I mean, there's a part of me that I've been so in 2013, I hosted the Toronto Bitcoin Summit. I charged 1 Bitcoin for people to participate, and some of the participants were the founders of Ethereum. Anthony
Oh wow.
Diorio and Vitalik Buterin, because they were in Toronto at that time here in Canada. I've always wanted to see blockchain as a concept, and I've certainly over the years as a futurist seen all sorts of pilot projects on the blockchain, but I've always been a disbeliever. I've always sort of been skeptical that it's a solution looking for a problem rather than
Mm.
an actual kind of thing that society needs. And Web 3.0 in particular, where, I've always been a fan of the metaverse as a concept. And one of my kind of corporate identities is meta views. that I'm really interested in, like Meta Views, which was a riff off the original Metaverse way back in the day.
Mm,
But the whole Web 3.0 thing kind of felt to me like it was a copyright, that it was digital rights management, that it was a way for generating receipts to prove that you own stuff. And I kind of think copyright is dumb. And I kind of think that copyright doesn't actually serve anybody other than the rich and the wealthy. And that I would rather see a kind of Creative Commons or, a kind of piracy in which all movies, all music, all knowledge was free. Like, to go back to my childhood, I grew up in a house that was full of culture, that was full of media, that was full of content. Imagine if every time I wanted to listen to a record or read a book or, watch a movie, I had to do chores or I had to pay my
mm,
parents. Like, what a dystopia. I
right.
would have grown up a real mean, nasty person, right? But instead, all that stuff was free, right? I could read all the
Yeah.
books. I could listen to all the records. I could watch all the movies, look at all the art, and no one charged me, right? It was all free. So yeah, I'm not into copyright. And that means to me where the blockchain has a lot of potential to do interesting things, I hope it's not to secure private property. I hope it's not to reinvent copyright because, oh, what a waste that would be when all the knowledge is at our fingertips. I say let it be free.
That just sparked a whole different question in my head. Because that's such an interesting concept, but I'm just trying to see if it actually, because obviously there is cost to go into creating art. There's humans that create art, and but I really like the idea that you just brought forth because it's kind of that theme of accessibility again. So making culture and insights accessible to everyone, which I, in a utopian world, would say yes, make it accessible and free to everyone. But yeah, how do you see that happening in the society we live in right now?
Well, the first is to acknowledge right now that copyright doesn't serve creators, it serves publishers, right? It serves the
Mm,
people who own the copyright, not the people who create the content. Right? Normally, the people who create the content have to sign like music contracts or film contracts or distribution contracts where they're giving up their rights of the stuff they created so that someone else can make money from it and then they get a little
mm,
cut. So I would rather see, to go back to our blockchain example, a scenario where all culture's free, but it's tracked. So we know automatically, hey, there's this many people who are listening to Taylor Swift. There's this many
mm,
people who are listening to Wandering Mike. There's this many people who are listening to Jesse Hirsh. And then at the end of the year, here you go. We've got our budget for culture and we allocate the
mm,
fees based on what people are watching, right? So instead of it being a
right.
pay first and then consume, it's a consume first and then pay. Right? So you allow
Mm,
everybody to listen and watch what they want. They have free choices. They can consume any movies, music, culture. And then at the end, you see, well, looks like Taylor Swift was really popular. So let's give her the resources that reflect the people's will. Right? Or look, here's all these
right.
people who are, somewhat popular, not Taylor Swift, but still, oh, we'll give them this amount of. So it's a different way of allocating those resources, right? Right now, it's not really fair at all because there's only a few companies that control the music industry, they control the film industry, they control these
Yeah.
industries because of copyright. But if you got rid of copyright, well, then anyone could put out music, anyone could make a movie, anyone could write a book, and then that book is available to everybody. And then whoever reads it and consumes it, then you go, okay, here you go, here's your check because you earned it as a result of people, so you flip it around. And when you flip it around, you're then empowering the creators, you're empowering the audience, and you're getting rid of the middlemen, you're getting rid of the companies who are the true beneficiaries of copyright, and they don't create anything. right? They're
Yeah.
they're they're kind of just sitting there, and anyway, I could go on and on about this, but I just feel we live on the internet where we have access to all this culture and content. We should not restrict how it flows. We should let people learn.
No, I love that point as well. And again, something I never heard like this worded before. And I do agree that this would probably encourage a lot of people to become creators as well, because a lot of people just these days are like, what's even the sense? Like you said, because it's all pretty much beforehand, it's going to be known who is going to be popular and who is. So,
And even then, it costs a lot of money, right? Versus, I ironically, software to create is becoming so affordable and cheap. There shouldn't be these
mm,
barriers to entry. We should be making it as easy as possible for people to create, for people to share what it is that they want to share.
definitely. Um, because I mean, that's the reason we do podcasts as well, right? That's why we just talk with people, is because everyone's perspective is valuable. So, yeah, we as humans should just be very interested in putting as much out there as we can.
And this is where I have to say from my own perspective, I remember a time where doing what you and I are doing right now was not only impossible, like you would never imagine that it could be possible, right? Like,
Right.
when I was younger, there were only a certain amount of radio stations and they wouldn't let anyone go on and make radio, right? Like
Mm,
the path to actually having a conversation like we're having, across distance, because you and I are not currently in the same room, and then be able to share that with others and share that with friends. Like, technically, not only was that impossible, but if you said to someone that people did it, they'd be like, "Oh, what kind of drugs are you taking?" Like, it was
really.
just so unbelievable. And now here we are, right? Where anyone can
Yeah.
make radio, anyone can have these types of conversations. So there is a wonder to it. There's a power to it that I think should be as accessible as possible.
Yeah. Um, I think that's a great way to finish off the technology topic for now. I don't know, maybe it'll take us back. But so the other thing is, and if I'm just gonna share a quick story to do the transition here, because we have all this technology. You also talked about metaverse, so it's like people are more and more into this digital world and trying to take everything out of that as well. But still, nature is super interesting to people as well. And about 3 or 4 weeks ago now, I did one of the hikes here in Queenstown, New Zealand, the Milford Track, which is a 5 day track, and it was sold out because people still want to do these things. They still want to enjoy nature, and they did enjoy, and I enjoyed it a lot. Every second of being in nature and having that connection with nature. So, yeah, maybe to transition to how you became a farmer again. How important do you see that connection with nature in your own life as well?
Tremendously important, and especially in terms of just health and sanity and well-being, but also, a form of technology. Like, it's worth remembering that farming is kind of the original field of technology, right? It's where
Mm,
people started to create tools, other than tools to kill people. It was where we started to create tools to grow food, right? And tools
right.
to sort of manage how we grow food. So it was, in that sense, a natural extension of my curiosity and my relationship to technology. But I found that the problem with living in a city was I was disconnected from nature, right?
Mm,
That I felt, as much as I love the parks in the city, and I was living in Toronto, which has a lot of trees. So for a city, it's a relatively green city, but I needed a different rhythm. I needed a different pace. And I also had I didn't understand it at the time, but I had a desire to live with animals, to be closer, with animals. And so for me, it was really about, to your point, having a place that I could walk every single day, that was never gonna sell out, that was always gonna be there, that could,
Like,
provide me with a sense of peace, while also finding a learning curve, i.e. farming, that I could get on that would be difficult and that would be challenging. But the paradox was there's no way I would have been able to do it without YouTube. Right? If it weren't
really?
for the internet and having access, as someone who knew nothing about farming, knew nothing about, living in a rural setting, but to have access to social media, have access to the internet so that any problem I had, I could Google it. I could watch a video. I could, find somebody who had had this problem before I had and figured out a solution. And that I wouldn't have been able to pull this off a couple of decades earlier because I just would have been
Mm,
like lost. But at least this way, I had access to that knowledge, which, made a huge difference. And, the benefit of Canada, quite like New Zealand, is we have some really breathtaking natural landscapes.
yeah.
And, it's hard to not wanna be part of that every single day. And I was lucky in that I did this a couple of years before the pandemic because, once the pandemic hit here in Canada, everyone fled the city. Everyone was like, "Oh, yeah, I
Right.
gotta get to the country. I gotta live, out in nature." And there was a
Mm,
huge, real estate, kinda bubble because everyone was selling their city home and trying to buy rural property. So I was
well,
lucky as a futurist that unconsciously, I just sorta knew that this was the right thing to do, and it it
mm,
it really worked out.
um, yeah, the YouTube part, again, is a great point because at the end of the day, it's how we use technology as well, right? We can do so many things with it, and if we know what we are using it for, it can be so helpful, and we have all these resources. Um, so yeah, to get into that learning curve as well, because um, I think a lot of people, like the majority of people that listen and in general, would agree that living as a farmer is a very sustainable way of living. But also, like you said, a lot of people don't know what they're doing. So, how how was that learning curve for you? And probably, like you said, there's still so much to learn and to like uh, become better every day. But yeah, just yeah, take us into that world of farming a little bit because I'm very fascinated by that.
I mean, it's exhilarating, and the learning curve never ends, right? Because you're kinda constantly expanding your capacity. I wouldn't be able to do this without my partner. I mean, she's very much the driver, where I am an avid learner. She certainly had a lot more experience with animals, than I did, and she still is, I would say, the main visionary for this kind of farming concept that we're trying to have. But to your point, a lot of farming, special couples, they'll sort of split in half where, one deals with the animals, the other deals with the equipment. One deals with managing the land, the other deals with managing the crops. So for me, a lot of this has been creating infrastructure. I love using. We have an excavator, for example. We have a tractor. So I love using the heavy machinery. I love being able to move earth. We started with animals because the farm that we got was really, overrun. It had been abandoned. It had kind of, been left to decay. So we needed a lot of poop, right? The way in
Mm,
which you create rich soil is by having animals who poop a lot. And we also started with goats. And the benefit of goats is they eat, like brush, they eat trees, they eat grass, like they just eat a lot of stuff. So we use our goats for what we call goatscaping, which is basically landscaping, where instead of lawnmowers, the goats kind of do all the work. And that has helped us kind of clear some of the land and open it up. And we've had a cow, we now have pigs, we've had all sorts of birds, a couple of horses, lots of dogs to protect them. So part of it has been learning how to support these animals, learning how to feed these animals, learning how, our goats are dairy goats, so they make a lot of milk, which we then turn into cheese and yogurt. My partner's also gotten into butchering, right? So we're eating those
Mm.
chickens and we're eating those pigs and again producing all this food on our own. And this past summer was our most successful in terms of growing vegetables and growing stuff in our we now have sort of three areas where we're growing because of course we have to fence them off. Otherwise the goats and the pigs and the other animals will just eat all the food that is meant for us. And
Right.
then, there's all the infrastructure there. So my other big project this year was solar, where I got our drive shed and barn completely off grid and just taught myself electricity and taught myself how to do solar power and everything associated with it. The same way that I'm building stuff now and, have a modest knowledge of like woodworking and carpentry and all of the stuff in the city. I knew nothing, right? I was a complete idiot and had no knowledge. But again, you just by necessity are teaching yourself how to do these projects and constantly expanding one's agricultural operations and capacity.
Um, an interesting point about that is basically the off-grid portion of it, because a lot of people that, or not a lot, but some people that go into farming, they do so because they want to be off-grid. And with everything that we discussed before and us talking on the internet as well, I just want to take into that question as well. Off Because I feel like nowadays you can be off grid, but you can still be online. Is that kind of the goal?
I mean, I laugh because I always feel it's kind of oxymoronic when you see these folks on YouTube saying that they're off grid, and I'm like, but you're on YouTube. How could you be off grid and be on YouTube? So it
Yeah.
is the ultimate paradox to be off grid and online. I to me, I'm old enough to remember that off grid means really off grid, not online
Yeah.
and not connected. Like you really are isolated,
Yeah.
versus I think the advantage is having all of the above, like where our barn and our drive shed is off grid, our house is. And in our house, we are using solar to reduce our electricity usage. But why would you disconnect from something as powerful and useful as the electricity grid, for example? The
Yeah.
same way that why would you abandon the internet and all the knowledge that it provides if it was available to you? So, yes, off grid and online is a wonderful paradox that some people are able to entertain. But the issue is to take advantage of all the resources that are available. And for us, the desire to have solar, the desire to have independent power generation is for when the grid goes offline, which it does,
Mm.
because of storms, because of, climate catastrophe. In that a part of my desire to get closer to nature was personal and health, but another was intellectual in that I wanted to be on the front lines of climate change. Like if climate change is going to happen, I'd rather not be stuck in a building in a city where I can do nothing. I'd rather be, living on land that I can understand how it changes, how it adapts, so I can adapt with it. Because if climate change is going to happen, you want to be flexible, you want to be resilient, you want to be able to adapt to what it offers. And that's where I felt that living in the country would be a far easier way to do that than living in the city.
Yeah. Um, so taking climate change into the discussion, before we started recording, we also kind of already touched on it a little bit. Um, but obviously, as a farmer, probably it's also something you are impacted more by than someone that lives in the city. So, um, yeah, how has that developed for you in your agricultural endeavors over the years?
Well, it definitely requires a new approach to agriculture in general. That the kind of industrial factory farming, kind of treating all land the same, that's just not viable anymore. And you
Mm.
really have to adapt to your particular situation. And the phrase, again, credit due to my partner, the lovely Dr. Jeanette Herla. There's this concept of agroecology where you're really trying to practice agriculture as part of the ecology of where you live. In our case, it's about using swales, which are basically sort of dug ditches so that if you have too much rain, it's able to have that rain not sort of overwhelm your plants, but it also absorbs as much water as possible so that if you have a drought, you're also allowing the soil, you're allowing the plants to get the most out of whatever rainwater does fall. So it's really taking a much more customized approach to how you're farming rather than when you, for example, see large farming fields where they all look the same and they all look uniform and they'll often be a single crop rather than a combination of crops that might benefit each other, that might provide shade to each other, that might share, the groundwater in terms of retaining it longer in the soil. So it's really just a more resilient approach, a more flexible approach in which you assume chaos, you assume crazy things are going to happen rather than the opposite, where you hope that it's all going to go well and you hope that it's all going to be, stable. It's assuming chaos and preparing for it and potentially benefiting and prospering from that volatility because you're prepared for, instead of, say, steady rain, a lot of rain and then no rain and then a lot of rain, which has been a real stress for a lot of farmers because they're not used to
Right.
those types of extremes.
S- So in that sense, that was a really interesting insight as well for someone who doesn't really know a lot about these things. But so that would mean that there's probably because to just again say a very general thing, maybe people would say nowadays, well, farming's been around, we know how to do it. But especially now with what you brought up, so over the next years, it's probably going to be a lot of change and a lot of trying to figure out how to do things more efficiently with the changing weather.
Well, and that's just it. And the paradox is, yes, we have as a species been farming for a long time. So there's a lot of knowledge there. There's a lot of tools. There's a lot of reasons why we've grown to 8 billion people is because we've gotten really good at making food. But the future is gonna be really challenging. There's interesting stuff around AI and agriculture and the way in which AI is potentially allowing farmers to do more, to be smarter, to be more resilient. The question then becomes how people choose to use AI, whether they, use AI to, continue to do things the way they always have and like blanket spraying and, sort of mass production versus what I'm describing, which is a more nimble, a more responsive approach. All is possible with the technology. And agriculture is an area that has always featured intense technological development precisely because nature is unpredictable, and it is this huge variable that requires us to, really hustle to understand the types of challenges that we face.
Um, Maybe to ask a question about the future there as well. But yeah, I don't know to what extent you're really into the topic of environmental change, like how deep you're into it. But um, yeah, just I'm very curious of your opinion. If you would have to give an outlook, what would you see in the future regarding that topic?
Nothing good, unfortunately. I mean, we are gonna see extreme weather events. We're gonna see major hurricanes, major storms, major wind, a major precipitation. Unfortunately, the incoming US government seems to be climate deniers, and they are still going to be of the belief that none of this has to do with carbon emissions or oil and gas. So while on the one hand we are going to see undeniable weather events that are just mind blowing in terms of their destruction, we're also going to have a mythology that says that it's not climate change, that it's something else. Like maybe the gods are angry, or it's AI. I mean, who knows what nonsense they'll put out there. Unfortunately, again, to go to my point about solar, people need to prepare themselves for massive power outages. People need to prepare themselves for, where they get their water, right? Where they get their food, right? Like, in your case, Mike, I'd say start making friends with local farmers, right?
Mhm.
Like, we take for granted, especially folks who live in the city, that everything you need is just there when you need it. And
Yeah.
climate change is going to disrupt that. It's not going to end it, right? Like society will continue. We will find ways to survive, but, to go back to our earlier point about convenience, those who have really benefited from the convenience that our society has offered them are maybe gonna find a little bit of disappointment in their future when they realize they can't rely on basic stuff like electricity or basic stuff like a food supply. Because if a storm washes out the road that, brings the groceries to the grocery store, that's an issue. And we saw this in Tennessee a month ago with Hurricane Helene, and it's going to happen more and more around the world. Again, people respond. We as a society will continue, but the types of interruptions we saw in the pandemic to supply chains and to how people access stuff, climate change is going to reproduce that. Not for as long. Like it's not going to be months and months. It'll be days or it'll be a couple of weeks because we'll get better at responding to these storms. But
Mhm.
it's not looking good. If you listen to climate scientists, if you start feeling, in my case, how the environment is responding to this, it's going to be about extremes. It's going to be about extreme weather, and unfortunately, that means preparing for it.
So there's another two or three questions that I just had on that. Um, I'll ask the most interesting one first. Do you think just in a like in a sense of is it the right thing to do? You think it is the right way for society to, like you said, deal with these storms, like combat these storms, saying like, oh, we want to keep our system going through these catastrophes rather than saying, oh well, maybe we should change something.
I think the change has to happen. I think the change will happen. I think there is a resilience to humanity that means we will adapt. And that's what I mean by, climate change isn't going to kill humans. Climate change is not going to kill society. But to your point, it better change it, right? Like if we don't change, we are going to face a lot of misery. We're going to face a lot of unnecessary pain. I mean, for example, there is an economic upside to climate change that every time a storm destroys a road, every time a storm destroys a building, every time a storm, destroys some part of infrastructure, there's money in building it back. There's jobs
Right.
in building it back. So, but to your point, we need a different society. We need a different way of using our resources. We need a different way of relating to our environment so that we don't treat it like a trash bin. We don't treat it like it's something disposable, but instead live with it, live in accordance with it so that, we benefit from life, we give back to life, right? It becomes a harmonious relationship rather than an oblivious relationship or a destructive relationship. But, one step at a time. And I think for a lot of people who live in cities, who enjoy a life of convenience, who take for granted how everything works, it's going to be a shock. It's gonna
Yeah.
be a rude awakening, and hopefully that will cause them to demand change and say, "Hey, this is not the world I wanna live."
Yeah. Um, so let me ask you about your opinion on another theory that uh, came to my mind while you were talking. Um, so we already discussed like the great things that came from technology, from globalization, all these things that weren't possible a lot of years ago. But then, as you also just mentioned, we're getting our bananas from Ecuador and all these things. And so, do you see a future at all where maybe we're going back to small communities and yeah, just that kind of life?
I absolutely, and I think part of that is human sanity, right? There's no reason, even in a large urban environment, why we can't be living in a small community. Like, that small
Yeah.
community could be rural, that small community could be urban, right? But I think fundamentally we lost our human connection that we used to have. And I think part of our response to climate change, part of our surviving to climate change will be about reestablishing that local connection. And to your point, it'll have to be food, right? Like, increasingly, we will have to be thinking about our food coming from nearby. We can still at times enjoy the treats of food brought from elsewhere in the world, but it should be way more expensive than it currently is. Like, we should be paying the true price of shipping those bananas, right? We should be paying the true price of, shipping those coffee beans while investing in local agriculture. But in a couple of years before I became a farmer, I was living in a tall glass condo in Toronto. And my apartment was facing the south, it was facing the sun, and I grew quite a few tomatoes and jalapenos in my
Mm.
window. And it kind of occurred to me that if you had an incentive, like, for example, if you grow food in your condo, you get $200 off a month on your fees or on your rent, right? And then in exchange, you share your surplus with your neighbors. So if everybody in the building was incentivized to have a garden and to grow food, and they all grew more than they needed, which is easy to do once you start a garden. And then they start sharing that food. I grow the tomatoes and jalapenos. You grow some carrots and celery. Other people grow some onions and garlic, and we share. And all of a sudden, the building itself is creating enough food, right? For people at least to augment what they would be buying from the store. And so, I think climate change is going to require that people start creating this kind of food locally, because it'll just be more and more difficult to ship food globally when, for example, the storms out in the Pacific Ocean
Yeah.
make it really expensive to have these tankers constantly shipping products, all around the world.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, I don't know if that's gonna be a more negative discussion, but I kind of want to use that to slightly transition into another topic that I feel like maybe you're passionate about as well. Because we already had so many great ideas that we heard from you, and that all make a lot of sense. And basically, I want to get into the political side of things because, I mean, especially or with the last example, maybe we don't really need a government because one person could maybe buy up a condo and could enforce these things. But on a big scale, it is mostly the governments who give our societies a way of how things are done. So, um, and obviously, things at the moment aren't done the way we just discussed them. Ideas like we just discussed them never even make it to the public media. Um, so, yeah, well, what is your thoughts on the way the governments, and again, it's a very generalization, but in general, are running things?
Rather poorly. And I would say that my entire life, I've kind of been waiting for the internet to take over. And that could have been either the internet takes over government and, the new government exists because they get the internet and they understand how to leverage it, or the internet offers a new form of governance that we start to use as a way of organizing our resources, or, maybe even the internet just changes how we do elections. So it changes
Mm.
who ends up being, and none of that has happened. And instead, we have governments that have no clue how the internet works and, tend to give us really poor, boring policies. And unfortunately, the politicians kind of range from bad to worse in that they're really, I find there isn't anyone you can point to and go, yeah, they're really accomplishing things. They're really making a difference. They're really changing stuff. I certainly, in the United States, we see things getting worse where, we really have, an idiot elected by idiots who is just going to help people steal and, loot whatever they can from the government while the billionaires get even richer. But I do fundamentally believe that the internet offers us an opportunity to correct things, to get things right. And, I have this kind of joke that the influencers of today are the politicians of tomorrow. That the
Mm.
people who have figured out how to use the internet to get attention, to mobilize attention, and build the kind of loyalty with their community, that they are kind of politicians. They're not politicians in the traditional sense of being elected to office, but they are politicians in that they have constituencies and they have political power. So I keep wondering, and maybe the next 4 years with the US government being as terrible as it is, maybe we will see this effort to figure out how does the internet align with the concept of government so that we actually do get kind of functioning government that's smart and fair and democratic. This is another reason why the blockchain stuff initially attracted me, because there are a lot of blockchain people who are saying, "Hey, we could make government better or we could make government irrelevant so that things kind of just happen on their own." But it's kind of all BS. Like it's all just, empty promises. I like that there are people thinking about this. I like that there are people on the internet saying, "Hey, there could be a better way of organizing it." But maybe we're lacking a social movement. Like maybe we're lacking a political movement that, all around the world kind of demands better government, demands better democracy, and kind of imagines how the internet plays a role in that. Because the one thing that's been true of my life is that the internet always wins. Right? And it doesn't mean that that's a good thing necessarily. There have been instances in which the internet wins and society loses, but I kind of feel that the internet has the authority of society. It's where we turn to for answers. It's where we spend our time. It's where we have meaningful conversations. And
Yeah.
so there hasn't really been a government that's figured that out. And even at a base level, like if I was a prime minister, if I was a president who aspired to greater government, I would create a ministry of the internet. And I would have in that ministry of the internet smart people to figure out how the government should use the internet to benefit the people. No one's done that yet. Like even Elon Musk, he's not even thinking about that. He's just thinking about his Doge coins, like not even, how to.
Yeah.
I'm rambling, but I think politically we're sort of in dark times, but the light is also there. And the light is the internet and the people who are expressing themselves with such great diversity and intelligence on the internet. If we could harness that for the greater good, that would be a powerful revolution.
Yes. That that word you just said, and obviously, just gonna say violence obviously never is a good thing. But I'm just wondering because we all in school we learn about history, we learn about the French Revolution, we learn about things where good things come after a revolution, but then in basically in the here and now, every time something is close to a revolution, we regard it as a bad thing. And we're like, why are they trying to overthrow? And everything's working. So it seems to be really difficult to start a revolution on whatever sense of the way.
Well, and I think in evoking the French Revolution, the danger is when violence spirals out of control. And I think that's what people naturally fear about any revolution is that, when you head towards the revolution, it all looks great. But then when you reach it, that's when the violence is not something that can be controlled. And that is very scary. But
Mm,
here's another crazy idea. What if the revolution has already happened and it's called the internet, right? It happened a
mm,
few decades ago. It's still happening right now. It is violent for some people, right? Like there is a lot of violence on the internet, and there is
mm,
a lot of violence that happens in society kind of as a consequence of stuff that people read on the internet and stuff that people experience on the internet. But what if the revolution has already happened, and for us to achieve peace, we just need to recognize it? And that's my point, that what if the internet has already changed society? What if the internet has already become more important than government and more powerful than government and more
mm.
capable than government? And all we need to do as a society is agree on that. Say, okay, yeah, we agree. Yeah, it's over. The revolution's over. The internet's won. We need a new government to form it, in the sense that, while, to use Reddit as an example, while there are lots of fights on Reddit every day, there's lots of disagreement on Reddit every day. You can even argue there's a lot of verbal violence on Reddit every day, to our earlier
Mm.
point about respect, but there's no actual violence on Reddit, at least as far as I know. Maybe in someone's, room or school, they fight over something they said on Reddit. But generally speaking, there's no violence there. So we already have the kind of parliament, we already have the Congress, and I don't mean Reddit, I mean the internet, that we can settle our differences without violence, without having to have the same type of, fighting that we see in the real world. The internet offers that. We just need to get it right. We just need to configure it a little so it's more functional. And then we have to have an alignment with government, where government agrees, yeah, it's the internet. And there's no government right now that's going to do that, but it could happen. There could be a peaceful internet revolution if we partly acknowledge that it's already happened, because the internet has already taken over pretty much all of society.
Um, I want to ask another interesting question. And again, my knowledge is very superficial here. But I'm just going to say when you say the internet has this power, one could also say, well, what is the internet? Because obviously there's Google has a lot of power, Meta has a lot of power, X. But what specifically is the internet? Where's the power in the internet?
So those companies, their power is a direct result of their status within the internet. And how do they accomplish that status? Attention. We give
Mm,
a lot of attention to Google. We give a lot of attention to X, unfortunately. We give a lot of attention to Meta and its various platforms, from WhatsApp to Facebook to Instagram. So this goes back to, what is AI? Well, the internet is a story. It's a story
mm,
we tell ourselves. But what is the government? The government is just a story. Now, it's a pretty powerful story that we send money to, and they have guns and tanks and,
mm,
all these resources. But the internet is also just a story. And because we believe in it so much, that the companies who are really good at becoming part of that story, of facilitating that story, of being leading characters in that story, they tend to have power too. And I'll take a step back, and I'll present an adjacent argument. So a lot of people like to say that data is power, right? That data is the new oil, that Google and Meta and all these companies, that they have the power they do because they have data, because they take our data and they monetize our data and they sell our data. And that is really the industry of the internet. And I think that that's nonsense. That's not true at all. Data has no value. Data is abundant, and every year we create more data than has ever existed in all of time previous. How could something that is so abundant be valuable? It's not. What is valuable is attention. And what all those companies do is they use data to get our attention. But if they don't have our attention, there is no value. And ironically, on the internet, anybody can get attention. Like this year, there was this young woman named Haley Welch, otherwise known as Hawk Tua, and she went from complete unknown to now being a controversial figure with her own pump and dump hot coin, right? So nowhere a human can go from nobody to very powerful because of attention. Right? Attention is the scarce commodity that is incredibly valuable. Attention is what the internet is good at organizing and allocating. And the companies that have power on the internet are the companies who are really, really effective at commanding and mobilizing attention. So to bring it back to politics and to bring it back to what is the internet, if we were to go to Plato and Plato's cave, the internet is the shadows on the wall that we stare at incessantly, trying to figure out the meaning of life. Right? The internet is the altar at the temple upon which we worship. Right? That we go and bow down and spend time every day. The internet is the commons. The internet is the town square. The internet is the place in which everybody congregates. But fundamentally, it's a story. It's a story we tell ourselves, and we tell it, and we are part of that story every single day. And that is why it has so much power over us. To our earlier conversation about being off grid, we could always turn it off. We could always say, okay, I don't want the internet no more. I'm going to go live in the country and be disconnected. But it turns out no one does that. Right? If the ideal scenario is off grid and online.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't want to go into too big into these things, but I kind of have to ask you this question because the way you explain things really resonates with me. And if people really listen to it, there's a great point in there. It's about the stories we tell each other. So, um, why do you think like it's really hard for people and we are an immense amount of people, and for a majority of people to just say, I don't believe the story anymore, whatever story it is that we just discussed. But because if one person doesn't believe a story anymore, nothing really changes except for that one person. But if a lot of people would do, it would change.
I mean, you sort of answered it. It's peer pressure, right? So much of society is based on peer pressure, right? And as children, we sort of know this, that our friends tend to have greater influence on us than our parents, right? In that
Yeah.
we really desire that sense of peer pressure. But I'd go even further and say that stories are effectively a virus, and that every story is itself a kind of virus. And some stories are more infectious than others. And some stories spread faster than others. And some
Mm.
stories do more damage. Some stories are good and benefit us, right? If I tell you a story about why sharing is good and why being generous is good, you could argue that that's a virtuous story because it encourages a behavior
Yeah.
that we as humans benefit from. So I think, to your point about the way in which change happens and the way in which stories spread, maybe we need to come up with better stories. Stories that are more infectious, stories that are fun, stories that get us to question why we do what we do. And that's why I would love to see a world in which there are even more podcasts than there are today. because people need to be creating their stories, sharing their stories, telling their stories. So we're not just telling the Hollywood stories, so that we're not just telling, the political stories that, make no sense or don't benefit us. But I think there's a certain convenience or laziness to the stories we tell, in that it's easier for us to tell a story about a celebrity than it is to tell the story about ourselves. And that maybe we should be telling more stories about ourselves and being vulnerable and being humble, rather than just telling stories about our heroes, whether they be celebrities or athletes or musicians. And that kind of reflects how we use the internet, that a lot of people use the internet to gossip about celebrities when they'd be better off maybe using the internet to, I don't know, talk about their dog and why they love their dog so much.
Yeah. Um, we covered so much, and we already talked about a lot of these points, but I feel like you're a very great person to ask one of the questions that I always asked in my very early episodes, didn't so in much of the last episodes, but with everything of that in mind, and maybe even everything that you have in your brain, what would you say is it that humans need right now, need for the future? What are the important things?
I think on an abstract level, curiosity and courage, right? In the sense that they need to be curious. We have access to all the world's knowledge, all the world's creativity. Enjoy it, absorb it, learn it, take it all in. But you also need the courage to be different, to think critically, to disagree respectfully, to dissent, and to find a way of being who you need to be, and who you have to be. And I think to accomplish all that, fundamentally, we need love. And, I was not being facetious when I said people could talk about their dog. The big thing that happened to me when moving from the city to the country is I now have dogs in my life. And, lots of people have dogs in the city. I never really felt comfortable having a dog in the city because, a dog likes to run. A dog likes to, I wanted to live with dogs who can run free and have that kind of joie de vivre. So I'm my greatest love affair in life now is with a dog, with many dogs. I
Mm.
think humans need love, and I think that that love very much comes from other human beings, but I think it also can and should come from animals because, interspecies communication and interspecies love is for me a real motivator around climate change. That, it isn't just about humans in nature, it's about all living creatures. I mean, I honestly believe that the trees talk to me. And I
Yeah.
talk to them, right? Like, I think plants are just as sentient as animals, and that is, while a radical position, it is something that fills me with joy, and allows that courage and creativity to be as present as I can make it.
Um, I'm sorry, but everything you say inspires a question in me. And I just feel like I have to ask you about this. I am a very spiritual person, and I believe in the universe and that we are all one. And I feel like I heard something like that in what you just said. So, yeah, maybe tell us a little bit about if a spiritual belief also like is present in your life and how you live your life.
Absolutely, and in fact, when I sort of said at the start of our conversation that when I was younger, I had a problematic relationship with time. I mean, that is fundamentally a spiritual sentence. Right? Our relationship with time is very much our relationship with the universe, our relationship with, things that are greater than us. And so I'm quite like yourself. I believe in the interconnectedness of all things. I, believe that there is, if there's something called God, it's in all of us and it's in all things. And that has very much on a subdued level driven my life. Like I've never been, I mean, jokingly, I used to say that I was an internet preacher, that I would sort of
Mm,
preach the gospel of the internet, but that's more comedy than sincerity. I believe that the universe is interconnected and therefore believe that the internet is interconnected as well. And it allows me to
right.
talk about those ideas. But I used to describe myself that politically, I was a Taoist. In that politically, I believed that, like the Tao, we want social harmony, that everything is connected, that, government and society should be like easy handed, but focused on that social harmony. And then religiously, I would describe myself as an anarchist because
Mm,
religiously, I believe that all people are good. And religiously, I believe that if we removed oppression, that if we removed violence, people would be free. And they would, and I describe that as a religion because politically it's not practical, right? Politically, it doesn't make as much sense. So in that sense, they kind of fuse together. That, I kind of my if I were to describe my religion, it's to treat people the way you want to be treated, right?
mm,
To be nice to other people, to kind of pay it forward, and the universe will repay you somehow, some way. And it is
yes.
that interconnectedness that I think helps drive my thoughts. But it's the internet that kind of manifests it. It's the internet that is the Tao. It's the internet that is the interconnectedness of all things. And I just keep trying to see the love in it rather than the hate, given that you could find both in great abundance.
Yes. Okay, but that finally was a good way to end it. Jesse, I could do this for hours. It was just such an engaging conversation. We touched on so many interesting parts. We heard so many inspiring ideas from you. Um, so the people that are as intrigued as I am from what you just said, if you can just let us know where they can find out more about what it is you do, can find more about you, and I'll put the links in the description as well for them to easily find.
I mean, I'd say the easiest thing is to just Google Jesse Hirsh. I've kind of over the last couple decades just put stuff on the internet, random stuff on the internet. I do have a website, jessehirsch.com, and I have a newsletter that I kind of talk about the future of authority and really think about
Mm.
authority in the context of everything we've discussed. But I really enjoyed this conversation. I kind of feel that you have a really keen ear in that you're really listening quite closely, and then the questions you ask really open up all more layers of understanding. So this has really been my pleasure in terms of having this conversation, and this is one of the reasons I really believe in podcasting, because I think that there is a wisdom that you're developing as a result of having these conversations with people and kind of listening to their stories. I think if there were more people doing what you were doing, we would be achieving the kind of society that over the course of this conversation we were dreaming.
Well, I appreciate that, Jesse. Thank you so much, and thank you for all your time and all your insights. And well, with that, I would say bye, everyone.